A small town is surprised by an invisible barrier that separates them from the rest of the country, and without knowing why, they will be trapped under a giant dome. That's why today, episodes 1 and 2 of Under the Dome. Remember that you can support the channel by clicking the join button. That way, you can become a member of Planeta Resumen and get a bunch of rewards like stickers, exclusive posts, shout-outs at the end of the video, and even choose the next movie. Now go join Planeta Resumen and let's get started. The story begins when our protagonist, Dale, is burying a man's corpse. And at the same time, the sheriff tells the owner of a restaurant that he will run for election again. Somewhere else, a couple is making love, and even though they're enjoying the moment, Angie reminds Junior that they can't have anything serious, since he'll be going back to college soon, which leads to an argument between them. Then we meet the new editor of the newspaper El Independiente named Julia. She visits a neighbor in town to get information about a propane shipment that has arrived in the town in recent weeks. The old woman believes this could cause an explosion and suspects that the sheriff is involved in it, since he didn't pay much attention when she reported it. After burying the body, Dale drives back in his car, and during a call he says that the dead man didn't want to pay his debt. And that's why everything got out of control. At that moment, a police car makes him nervous. And on the other side, we see that the officers notice his car doesn't have a front license plate. Luckily for Dale, nothing else happens, and shortly after, he has a minor accident where his tire gets ruined in the middle of a field full of cattle. At that moment, an earthquake shakes the whole town, so we see all our main characters scared, not knowing what's happening. And seconds later, a blast hits the field where Dale is. Right in front of his eyes, we see a cow split in half, and as he gets closer, he discovers that there's some kind of invisible wall that somehow separates the area. There, a boy named Joe approaches Dale to offer him help because he saw his accident. And he's also surprised when he sees the division with the transparent wall. At the same time, the police officers report a failure in the phone signals. Back in the field, we see that the birds and a small plane crash into the glass wall, and they do their best to stop an ambulance before it crashes into that same barrier. One of the firefighters runs out to help them, but then he crashes into the glass without knowing what's happening. The only thing that's working is the radio station, where Phil feels lucky to be the only station on the air. And then the officers meet with Dale to find out what's going on. That way, we discover that the glass barrier also prevents people from hearing what those on the other side are saying. And when Councilman James Rennie arrives at the scene, we finally confirm that the entire town is under a huge glass dome. On the other hand, we meet Nori and Alice along with their daughter Nori, who are on their way to a rehab program for the girl in Los Angeles, unaware of what's happening. Back at the invisible barrier, we see Julia arrive to cover the news, and that's when we find out that Dale is a former soldier. At the same time, Councilman Rennie forces his way into the radio station to broadcast an emergency message with the intention of preventing deaths in the town. Just when Junior tries to cut his veins, but when they hear the councilman, he decides to stay alive. Rennie asks them to stop all the cars, and then Caroline and her family see a truck crash into the invisible barrier just at the right moment to stop in time. The bad thing is that out of nowhere, Nori starts having convulsions. Meanwhile, Joe returns home where his sister Angie asks him about their parents, who have been trapped on the other side of the barrier. Because of everything that's happening, the hospital's overwhelmed, and there we see Julia arrive to look for her husband, who's a doctor. But to her surprise, we find out that he hasn't worked there for many months. Outside, we see a group of soldiers and specialists dressed in protective suits while they investigate. And at the same time, Dale approaches Angie to share a cigarette. The problem is that Junior watches them from a distance, feeling jealous. At that moment, Alice and Caroline arrive with their daughter, making Angie take care of her, so Junior starts to chase our protagonist. At nightfall, the sheriff reports that many officers were left outside, and the councilman is worried about the propane business they have together, so he threatens the officer to make sure they support everything. Meanwhile, Junior starts a fight with Dale because he thinks he hooked up with his girl. And in the middle of this, Julia shows up to calm things down. Afterwards, she tells Dale that she hasn't found her husband and offers her house for him to stay tonight. Later, Joe goes with a friend to investigate the invisible barrier, but suddenly he starts convulsing, just like what happened to Nori. And on the other hand, Angie arrives home, where Junior grabs her by force to make her faint, taking control of the girl. So far, 12 people have died in the town, so everyone is starting to worry. And the only thing they can do is help each other while the government solves the situation. Hours later, Angie wakes up in some kind of bunker where Junior has her locked up. And with his psychopathic look, he tells her that he'll keep her safe in this place. She tries to escape again, but the guy is stronger and once again leaves her locked up in this underground place. When he comes out, we see Rennie arrive, who turns out to be his father, and that's why Junior offers to help him with whatever he needs to get out of this situation, since he won't be able to keep studying because his school ended up outside the dome. Meanwhile, Julia arrives at her house accompanied by Dale, and through a picture frame we find out that her husband, Peter, is none other than the man who was killed and buried by our protagonist a few hours earlier. The journalist says that maybe her husband is missing because he's cheating on her with another woman, and Dale pretends not to know anything about him, saying that he would like to meet him soon. In the town, the police continue investigating what's happening, coming to the conclusion that maybe the lockdown is part of a punishment. Then the sheriff touches the invisible barrier out of curiosity, and he starts telling Officer Linda that a year ago he was offered a shady deal. And right then he starts to feel unwell. Suddenly, his pacemaker explodes and the officer falls unconscious to the ground, while Linda tries to get help. But the soldiers on the other side can't do anything about it. And that's how the first episode ends. In episode 2, we see Dale beating Iulia's husband in search of information, and in the middle of a struggle, he ends up killing the man with a gunshot. At that moment, Iulia wakes up and enters the room to ask if he's okay because she heard him scream. He tells her that nothing is wrong and asks her about a military identification tag that he lost the day before. He's worried because maybe he dropped it during the struggle with the journalist's husband. On the other hand, Joe's friend tells him that he should rest after having a seizure the night before. And he tells him that at that moment he was saying things about some pink stars, which seems strange to both of them. On the radio, they hear the military frequency where they talk about a dome, so Phil wants to inform the town about this, but his companion doesn't allow him to. The next day, Linda goes looking for Rennie to tell her that the sheriff died the night before. And at the same time, the journalist discovers that the military outside have orders not to pay attention to those who are trapped. So the town is probably the subject of an experiment. Meanwhile, Angie is still locked in the bunker. And when Junior brings her something to eat, she tries to escape again, but she can't because the main door is locked. And because of her rebelliousness, he decides to chain her by the ankle. He confesses to her that he's doing all this because he believes the girl changed all of a sudden, right when the dome appeared. And he tells her that he won't take her to the hospital so she won't meet Dale, since he knows that he's her lover. Angie, did you love me? And when this thing disappears, will you do it again? To provoke him, Angie tells him that she's in love with Dale, and because of his annoyance, Junior decides to leave, locking her up somewhere else. Rennie discovers that the priest in charge of the morgue is high, so he starts threatening him with ruining the business they have together, and he warns him that none of that can be found out. Later, Linda arrives at the sheriff's office and is surprised to see Rennie there, going through his things, but he pretends to be worried about the will. So, we find out that the officer left his house and all his belongings to Linda, since he loved her as if she were his daughter. At the same time, Julia arrives at the radio station, and when she hears the military frequency, she finds out that the town is under a dome. So she takes control of the microphones, and that's how she tells the truth, leaving everyone in town worried about what's happening. At another moment, the priest manages to get close to Linda, and without her noticing, steals the key to her inherited house. Also, Joe and his friends see that on the other side of the dome, some scientists are testing the invisible barrier with a water hose. And when the boy touches that area, he discovers that the water passes through to the inside. On the radio, they hear that outside they haven't been able to identify the origin or the material of the dome. So they're sure that the military isn't responsible for what's happening. Back with Junior, we see that the boy starts following Dale until he reaches an abandoned house. There, the former soldier finds the weapon he used to kill Julia's husband, and it's empty. He also finds his identification badge, and right at that moment, Junior comes in to accuse him of getting intimate with Angie in that same house. Our protagonist doesn't understand what's happening, and the two start fighting until Dale breaks his nose with his fists. On the other hand, the priest arrives at the sheriff's house to look for a document about the propane, and when he finds it, he decides to burn it, causing a big fire that gets out of control. Meanwhile, Joe and his friend find a puppy next to half of a body that was cut in half by the dome, and suddenly they notice a fire nearby, so they decide to run over there to investigate. Also, Linda is surprised by one of her colleagues who gives her some long guns so they can be prepared, because the situation could get out of control at any moment. Then, the officers say that the firefighters are outside and the only way to stay safe is to take care of things themselves. At that moment, Dale appears, and together they head to the house. But the first to arrive is Rennie, who hears the priest trapped in the fire, calling for help. And when the officers arrive, they start organizing the neighbors to put out the fire. With everyone's help, Julia also arrives to cover the news, saying that it hasn't rained for days, and now that they're trapped, it won't happen either. That's why they ask for water bullets to help with that. Linda hears the priest shouting for help, so she runs to rescue him, while Rennie decides to run away. Quickly, Linda finds the priest unconscious and manages to get them out of there. The problem is that another officer discovers a propane tank in the house's yard, and after a few seconds, an explosion occurs. After this, we see that the neighbors all work together to put out the fire with buckets of water. But the flames are high and spread everywhere. Out of nowhere, Rennie appears with an excavator to demolish the house and in this way put out the fire. In the bunker, we see Junior telling Angie that he killed her lover, but she doesn't believe he's capable of doing something so terrible. And before leaving, the boy gives her an old photo of them to remind her how much they loved each other. Back in the town, we see the priest reacting and Rennie scolds him for taking a risk and causing a fire. But the priest manages to throw Linda off by telling her that he entered the sheriff's house because he was looking for a suit for his funeral. Then all the neighbors start applauding Linda and the councilman in gratitude for saving the town. And after a great speech, one of the police officers appears completely crazed, threatening to shoot since he accuses everyone of lying because things are not going well at all. This officer starts shooting at the dome without knowing that the bullets bounce off when they hit the barriers. And in doing so, he ends up killing his partner Freddie. Luckily, Dave manages to neutralize him, and the rest of the people are completely shocked by what just happened. This was episodes 1 and 2 of Under the Dome. Don't forget to like, comment about which other movies you want to see on the channel, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos.